Hi everyone. Thank you everyone for joining. We'll just give it a couple of minutes before we start, just to let people filter through, and then we'll begin. I think um, we could probably get going. I'll just obviously people will still be starting to join, but I'll just quickly go over the agenda. So as I said, welcome to today's HNES Round 9 application seminar, followed by Q&A. Just some sort of housekeeping items. I'm sure you've all heard this a million times before, but please just mute your microphones, and if you're not speaking, if you're a speaker, make sure to turn off your webcams just to make sure that video quality is improved and remove sort of distractions. Um, please use the Q&A. I know there's a chat function on this, but please do use the Q&A functionality if you have any questions to ask, and then we can obviously respond to them either verbally or we can just type it into a response. And the other thing to mention is that this webinar is being recorded and transcribed, and the slides and the recording will be distributed after the event for anyone who wants to revisit some of the slides or anyone who wasn't able to join today. So, without further ado, I'll go over the agenda quickly, and then I'll hand over to Louise. So, first, we'll be doing a bit of an introduction to HNES, some examples of some of our funded projects, and recent funding announcements from rounds 1 to 6. Then Katie will be going over the optimization studies and the application process for that specific section. Then Alison will be picking up the assessment process, and I'll just sort of host the Q&A and provide a bit of information about where you can find support for potential if you're looking to submit an application. Yeah, as I said, without further ado, I will hand over to Louise Singleton, HNES Program Manager, who will pick up the HNES introduction.
Thank you very much, Michael. Hi, everyone. So yeah, I'm sure some of you will have come across me before, but yeah, I'm Louise Singleton, and I run the HNES scheme for GemServe on behalf of the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. So if we go to the next slide, please. So just to give you a bit of context of where HNES sits within the government's Heat Networks Transformation Programme. So there are a number of different schemes and initiatives that the government has put in place to support the development of heat networks, starting back in 2013 with the setup of the Heat Networks Delivery Unit. And then in 2018, the first kind of grant funding scheme for heat networks was introduced, the Heat Network Investment Project. And that was designed to help fund the building of new heat networks. And then that was subsequently superseded by the Green Heat Network Fund, which again is funding new heat networks, but also supporting transition to green technologies from fossil fuel heating sources. In 2021, the government kind of recognised that there were a number of heat networks already in the country, and they weren't always operating as efficiently as they might do. So they ran a short funding round HNES demonstrator scheme, and that was really successful, and that was used to then inform the main scheme, which is where we are now. And we're now looking at obviously round 9 for funding. So yeah, we've had many applications come through, many funded projects, and we're getting to the point now where, particularly on our capital projects, they are completing on their works and starting to really realise the benefits of the funding that they've been awarded. There's obviously other elements that are ongoing within the market. So we've got zoning, which is coming forward, and also the Heat Networks Technical Assurance Scheme, or HNTAS. So this is a set of technical standards that heat networks will need to comply with over the coming years. So HNES can really support heat network operators in providing funding to help them improve their heat networks to be able to meet the requirements of the HNTAS scheme. So it's definitely something to be aware of what the standards are that are coming out of HNTAS, and understanding how HNES can support you in providing funding to help you meet those requirements. Okay, if we go to the next slide. So there are three main aims of HNES. The first one is to reduce carbon emissions by making heat networks more efficient. So obviously we've got net zero targets to meet by 2050. We really want to make sure that the heat networks that we have in the UK are operating as efficiently as possible, and not wasting energy and carbon. So we want to make sure we're improving on our carbon emissions. The second one is to reduce customer detriment to improve consumer confidence. So HNES, the main scheme, was introduced in sort of 2023. Obviously, we've been through the energy crisis. We really want to make sure that particularly those customers that are on low incomes, that in sort of social housing, for example, or I don't know, so council housing, or really don't have the financial sort of amounts to be able to pay for inefficient heat networks, are really being supported by improving the efficiency of the heat networks, reducing the amount of energy that's being wasted, and thereby bringing down consumer bills, particularly for those that can't really afford bills as they are, let alone for inefficient heat networks. If we are to meet our 2050 targets, we need to increase the number of heat networks from about 2% to about 18%. So we really want people that are on existing heat networks to be having a good news story, really positive about the heat networks that they have, and really encouraging others to understand that these are good technologies that can help them as well. So we really want to be making sure that people are happy with their existing heat networks. And then the final one, as I've mentioned, the heat network market is moving towards sector regulation and technical standards. So that's the HNTAS scheme that I was mentioning before. So again, HNES is available to support organisations moving towards those standards as they come into force. Okay, next slide, please. So in terms of our funding, we have two types of funding available. The first is revenue grants. So this is essentially funding typically between £15,000 to £24,000 for those heat networks that know that their networks aren't performing particularly well, but they're not really sure why, and what they should be doing about it. So the revenue grants are to pay for an external consultant to go in, look at the heat network as it is operating now, understand how efficient it is, how much energy is it using, and then identify areas of improvement and particular measures that might be suitable to be installed, and the extent to which that can improve the efficiency of the network. And it would also provide you with ideas of costs and payback periods and that kind of thing. Ideally with a view to that being taken forward to a business case for actually getting those capital measures installed. And then that leads us on to the capital grants. So that's actually funding to install the eligible measures that have been identified. So you don't have to do an HNES funded optimization study before applying for a capital grant, but we would want to understand how you've identified the measures that you're applying for and why you think those ones are the suitable ones for the network. From a capital perspective, it's part funding, so we can fund up to, but not including, 50% of the overall project costs for eligible measures. So there is an element of match funding required from the applicant to cover the additional costs. In round 9, capital projects will be able to apply for funding in next financial year, so starting from April all the way through to March 2027. And for revenue projects, it will just be for the next financial year, 25-26. There is funding available in that year, but it's obviously subject to availability and how many projects we get through. You must spend your grant funding in the year it's allocated. So if you have a capital project, you can apply for funding in both next financial year and the financial year afterwards, but you must spend the money you've requested in 25-26 in that financial year, and then whatever you requested in 26-27 in that financial year. So it's really important when you're completing your application form to really look at your project program, understand when you think elements will be delivered, and make sure you're being as realistic as possible as to which financial years you will expect to draw the funding down. But it's worth noting that your match funding doesn't have to be spent at the same time as your grant funding. So a typical example is if you're looking to install an HRU, for example, you could use the funding in 25-26 to purchase the HRUs, like the grant funding, for example, and then in the subsequent year, you could use your match funding for the actual installation and commissioning of the HRUs. So it doesn't have to be a kind of equal spend the whole way through the program, as long as at the end of the project the match funding element is greater than the grant funding element, then that's fine. Next slide, please. So in terms of what's eligible for capital grants, we essentially cover everything through from the energy centre through to the tertiary network and elements of metering as well. So obviously the network has to be an existing network. We can't fund extensions or building of new heat networks. Any capital costs that have already incurred prior to the HNES award having been made. So if you were successful, you will receive a funding letter. And so any work that happens after the date of you receiving that funding letter would be eligible. Anything that happens prior to that wouldn't be eligible. So again, it's worth looking at your project program and working out timings relating to that. Anything not to do with the heat network infrastructure. So improvements to building fabric wouldn't be eligible under capital costs. And anything to do with engagement activities, so internal project management, any stakeholder management, that wouldn't be covered either. Specifically within the energy centre, we are not able to cover the costs of replacing the primary heat source. So we can look at things within the energy centre, like replacing of pipeworks or replacing of pumps or controls, but actually switching out a gas boiler for I don't know, a heat pump or something like that, we wouldn't be able to cover the replacement of the heat source. Within tertiary dwellings, tertiary systems, we can't cover the buying or replacing of pipework or heat emitters. So it's essentially kind of anything, if you've got an HRU in place, it's kind of anything up to the HRU. Anything past the HRU wouldn't be covered unless it's things to do with smart controls. So within dwellings, we can cover TRVs typically, or those kind of smart control systems, but actually replacing pipework and radiators we can't cover. And then on the metering side, we can cover costs for metering as long as it's not a legal requirement under the heat network metering and billing regs. So if you do have a legal obligation under that regulation, then you will need to pay for the metering yourself. If what you're applying for goes in above and beyond the billing regs, or you've done a cost assessment and it's deemed that it's not cost effective for you to install them, or you're exempt from the metering and billing regs, then we can fund metering in those instances. We do have a guidance for applicants document, and within that we provide more detail on what is eligible. But just for the sort of conscious of time, it's easier to talk about what's ineligible rather than what's eligible. But I'd advise you, we'll put a link to it in the chat, but I'd advise everyone to have a read of the guidance document before applying, just so that you're aware of the more detail around what's eligible and what isn't. And the next slide, and then from a revenue perspective, again within that document that I've referenced, the guidance for applicants document, we have an annex at the back which outlines what we would expect to see from an optimization study. So there's different elements which Katie will talk through shortly, but we would expect the final deliverable to align with what we've got in our annex. Again, from an eligible perspective, any work that's already been commissioned or incurred before the application wouldn't be able to be funded. Any internal project management costs, and anything to do with construction, operation and maintenance of the heat network. So the revenue grants is solely to fund optimization studies. It's not for anything to do with sort of actually making the changes to the network itself. Okay, next slide, please. So in terms of who can apply, so as I said, it has to be operators of existing heat networks, and that can be either a district heat network or a communal heat network. The fund's open to heat networks in England or Wales. And in terms of the applicants, it can be anyone within private sector, public sector, third sector, hospitals, universities, charities, essentially any legal authority that has a legal entity that is able to make financial decisions for the heat network. So that's particularly important on the capital side because obviously there's this match funding element. So we need to make sure that the applicant is aware of the match funding requirement and they have the ability to cover the match funding costs. But from a revenue perspective as well, obviously, if we're paying for a study to be undertaken, we want to make sure that there is at least an appetite to review the sort of recommendations that come out of that study and take some of those forward where possible. So we can't accept applications from consultants, for example, who might be looking to undertake an optimization study. It needs to come from the heat network operator themselves, so that we know that they are aware that the application has been made and they're committed to the project. Next slide, please. So we're obviously here to talk about round 9. So that closes on the 28th of March. We'll talk through later about how to apply, but essentially we will set you up with a SharePoint space for each project. And we ask that if you would like to apply, that you email hnes@gemserve.com by the 21st of March to request a SharePoint space so that we can get those set up well in advance of the 28th of March deadline. There will be around 10. We haven't yet confirmed the dates for that yet, but yeah, there will be future funding rounds after round 9. So kind of watch this space for those dates. Again, we'll talk later on. We have a mailing list. If you'd like to sign up to receive those updates, then please sign. For round 8. So they are version 8 for the capital applications and version 6 for the revenue applications. But if you would like to request a copy of the application forms, again, please email hnes@gemserve.com and we'll be able to issue that out to you. But yeah, for those of you that have applied in round 8, it's the same application forms. Okay, next slide. So just quickly to talk you through, just to give you a bit of an idea of projects that we've previously funded in previous funding rounds. So as Michael said, this covers rounds 1 to 6. So we've obviously had a couple of other funding rounds since then, but we've yet to announce officially what the outcomes of those were. So from rounds 1 to 6, we funded 233 projects and awarded just shy of £35 million, benefiting around 43,000 residents. So some of the funded sectors, I think I've spoken to those before. Yeah, housing associations, local authorities, private sector, health sector. So yeah, a range of different organisations have received funding. Go to the next slide. What has been funded and where? So this just gives an idea of where across the England and Wales we've provided funding. Some of the types of measures that we've funded, so upgrading or fully replacing pipework, improving insulation. Some of the networks that we've had receive funding were built in the 1970s, and so the insulation is a lot less than we would expect to see today. So looking to increase that to reduce heat losses. Updating controls, like I say, whether that's in the energy centre or throughout the network. Replacing or recommissioning HIUs, looking at measures to improve water quality, and also reducing leaks. So a range of different elements that have been funded under capital projects. And then the next slide is just an example of, so for round 6, we awarded 2.7 million to 33 different heat networks. Again, we'll share these slides afterwards. There's a link at the bottom there to our press release, and that will take you to our website, and that you can see all the press releases for the previous rounds as well, and particularly for the capital projects, that gives a bit more detail on the types of works that have been funded. So if you're interested to see what other projects have been funded, then that's a good place to start. I think
Great.
that might be me done.
Yep. Thanks, Louise. Just
No
to update everyone, we will have a Q&A at the end, but there's just a question that's come in for you, Louise. Basically asking, because I know you mentioned that obviously heated system replacements aren't covered. Are there any schemes on the DESNZ radar for replacing boilers? So aside from HNES?
Not that I'm aware of. It's probably more of a question for DESNZ rather than myself. Depending on the size of the network, obviously the Green Heat Network Fund does exist within England, but that's obviously for larger. There's a kind of a minimum level of sort of thresholds that you need to meet in order to be eligible for that scheme, which I'm conscious that many of our kind of HNES funded schemes in and of themselves wouldn't be eligible for. It's something that DESNZ is aware of, that there is a gap in the funding market, but I'm not aware of anything specific that they're looking to bring forward at this stage to address this. But it's something we have raised with them in the past, that that this gap does exist.
Great.
Oh,
sorry,
yeah,
Louise.
sorry, I was going to say there's another one in there as well, around HNES reports. So HNES was the heat network optimization opportunities scheme, I think it was, which is another DESNZ scheme. It's absolutely fine to use those reports if to apply straight away for capital works. You don't need to go through the HNES optimization study route. In fact, if you have an HNES report, we'd probably be questioning why you need to go down the optimization, the revenue route for HNES. So yeah, like I say, it's not a prerequisite that you have to do revenue applications through HNES before you do a capital project. We just want to understand how you've arrived at the measures that you're choosing, and why you think they're the suitable ones. So as long as you've got a sort of a study that explains that for us, then it doesn't have to be an HNES funded optimization study.
Thanks, Louise. There are a few more in the Q&A and the chat, but I think we'll pick those up during the Q&A section. Otherwise, we'll never get to Katie's section if possible.
No worries.
But yeah, if I can ask everyone to obviously, if you can, put your messages in the Q&A function, if at all possible. Let us know if you're having any issues with accessing that. I'll now pass over to Katie, who will go over the optimization studies section.
Hello everyone, my name is Katie and I work with GenServe as well. For HNES, I do a lot of relationship manager work and applicant support. So if you haven't already, you'll probably see my name pop up. So I just want to run through the optimization studies. Next slide, please, Michael. There is a couple of parts to it for the final optimization report. The first one being work package 1. The aim of this is to investigate and assess the network's current operational performance and the conditions of the network in order to develop a baseline against the optimization measures. So the baseline is needed so we can see what optimization measures can be developed and the impact that they'll have, which comes into play with work package 2. It's also so that the heat network operator understands the causes of the suboptimal performance and the impact that they have on the operation of the network and its customers. I would also say on these steps, these are a requirement, and it is, again, if you have a read of the guidance, it's in there as well. But in the Work Package 1 section of the report, we need site visits. So this will include pictures, diagrams, or descriptions of the heat network. Again, baseline data of the network performance and KPIs. And it must cover the assessment of the whole network architecture, which means including the plant room energy centre, primary or secondary or tertiary network, and customer interfaces. We'll also say that the KPIs form the basis of considering the benefits and the cost effectiveness of the proposed optimization recommendations. So they are important. As much data that you can gather, if you can put that in the report, then it'll give a better understanding of where you can go from there. And next slide, please, Michael. So on to Work Package 2. The aim of Work Package 2 is to identify and develop the potential optimization measures and to quantify the costs and the impacts that the measures could have on the network performance. In this, the heat network operator will receive a report with a very robust analysis of the recommendations offered and which will show a course of action to improve the operational performance and any customer outcomes that it may achieve. So for this, these steps are to develop the development of the optimization measures and packages of measures, 2, a rundown of the costs and the cost effectiveness of optimization packages, and 3, reporting and recommendations. To show this, there is a table again in the guidance you can use for reference, but a table is required to sort of show the changes of in KPIs from what each package will achieve, to sort of have a clearer idea of what's actually being improved on. If you can input that into the report, that would be great. I would say that we also, which I'll touch on in the final deliverables, but it is important as well to upload the techno-economic analysis, which should be in an unlocked Excel document. This needs to show like the findings, any costings, measures, and things like that. We don't have a template or anything for this, but the consultant, whoever's doing the optimization study, should be able to gather this information for you, because it is just another a more sort of adjustable version of what's written in the report, just so you're aware. And then on to the next slide, please. Okay, great. So the final things that we'll need in a breakdown is the project report, which should include the baseline data, and the site visit, again, which need pictures of the site, the heat network, and diagrams of the network. The techno-economic analysis in an unlocked Excel document, which should include the breakdown of the costs, and a final submission of the revenue M&R worksheet, which including the optimization study outputs annex. We do also encourage applicants who have had a revenue application to apply for capital funding, so they can sort of implement the measures that they've just found out about, and we can help with that. Okay, great. So next slide, please. Just want to talk a bit to you about the application process. The application form is in an Excel format, and there are different formats for the capital and revenue applications. You can check the completion status of your application in the application status tabs, and it'll come up either like red or green if something's been missed or it's incomplete. As Louise mentioned earlier, the current versions are version 8 for capital and version 6 for revenue. On to the next slide, please. So tab A is to ensure the name of, please ensure that the name of the applicant matches the legal entity name exactly, e.g. as it's listed on Companies House. I would also say ensure that the VAT number is input if your organisation has one. Things like this can prevent a lot of clarifications and extended time of coming back requesting further information if you just make sure everything's in in the application form that possibly can be. Tab D, this is about your project details. Again, we need a sort of description of the network, including the address. Again, make sure that this information is accurate. And there's a bit on whether there's any customers in need and any sort of regularity parts that you have, such as registering under HNMBR. Tab C is for the project narrative, and this is your chance to tell us about your project. Please be as detailed as you can and cover all of the information that is asked for in this tab as it is used as part of the assessment. And again, it will save a lot of time. It will save a lot of questions having to come back and repeatedly bring things up that might not be covered. And next slide, please. And then for tab D then, again, please enter as much information as you can, especially in capital projects, although for both it does apply. And I would say if it is a measure that you want to improve as part of your application, then we do need to know the baseline as well as the target. You will see the sections on there in the application form. These numbers should be calculated if you don't know them. I would sometimes say that can be useful for revenue applications. I know obviously a lot of information you'll be looking for in the optimization study, but we do require certain aspects of baseline data that you have at the moment. And you can put in, so like sometimes the target might be the same as the baseline. If so, this still needs to be entered into the target section. And then on tab E, if you request irrecoverable VAT, make sure that you include justification as to why it is being claimed. And if you're including contingency, it's best to put this into the other section of tab E, such as funding and procurement, to make sure it can be clearly identified. And for tab F, these are all your confirmations and declarations of the supporting documents, which need to be uploaded as part of your application. And next slide, please. So for this, listed some of the things that are required for supporting evidence. Obviously, we will send, as Michael said before, we will send these slides out to you. I would want to pull out the more important parts, which are the project plan, any quotes for any works or optimization studies, and any confirmations, and that applies to both capital and revenue. Other things, you can upload a summary of the programme of works. We do send out an AP1A supplier form to be completed in the application pack. So if you can complete that and upload that with your application form, that would be great. And any sort of evidence or eligibility of metering costs relative to HNMBR requirements. And then I think that's about it, I would say. In terms of applying for, onto the next slide, please. In terms of applying for multiple projects, we do, again, if you're submitting multiple projects for revenue grants, we would say that applicants will need to explain how the networks differ in terms of engineering, design or operation, and showing any indicators of suboptimal performance and indicators of customer detriment, and justify as to why multiple studies are necessary and learnings can't be shared. If you're submitting multiple applications in the same funding round for capital grants, consideration should be given as to whether the capital works are similar in nature and if lessons could be learned and efficiencies made by running projects sequentially rather than parallel. If you're submitting further applications after funding has already been awarded in previous rounds for revenue grants, we would say applicants will need to explain how learnings from previous studies have been used and why they can't be applied to new applications. And for capital grants, they should explain how lessons learned from previous projects have been incorporated into the new application where applicable. Again, we do encourage capital applications from heat networks that have previously been awarded revenue funding to help implement the recommended capital measures. And on to the next slide, please. So to submit an application, you'll need to request an application form from us. So please email hnes@gemserve.com to request a form. And if you would like support from a relationship manager, such as myself or someone in the team, please let us know when you'd like to request an application form, and we can discuss it in a meeting. You'll also be able to request a SharePoint space to submit your application form. For round 9, the deadline is Friday, the 21st of March. And I think now, if anyone has any questions at the moment, or do you want me to answer in the Q&A? I can pass over to Alison if not.
Thanks, Katie. I think, oh, you can't see me. There we are. I think Louise has been typing away, trying to answer a lot of the questions already in the chat. But as I said, we'll have a Q&A section at the end where we can go over any bigger questions or any new ones that have come through. So let's go straight over to Alison to talk about the assessment process.
Thank you. Great.
Thank you, Katie. My name's Alison. I mainly deal with the monitoring and reporting side of HNES, so actually after the assessment process, but I'm covering the assessment process in this webinar. So first slide, can I have the next slide, please? So the scoring criteria for applications, this is how we'll score the applications we receive. For capital applications, there are 5 criteria that are used to assess the applications. The first one is deliverability on the first line, and that includes cost certainty and delivery certainty. So cost certainty, you will have requested a particular grant amount and you'll need to provide figures to show the project cost and the amount of HNES funding and match funding if that's applicable. And you'll need to show how you have arrived at that figure. And it would be to your benefit to support that with some quotations or a quotation to support that the amount that you're requesting and the total project costs. And then delivery certainty, you should provide us with a project plan to show when you expect to complete the works and the project timetable. So we need to make sure that the grant amount being awarded will be spent within the financial year it was awarded for, and that the delivery timescales are realistic and achievable. So on to number 2, that's the network performance improvement. So there are several metrics in this section, and that they include how much do you expect to reduce the cost to the operator of delivering heat to the end customer? How much will the efficiency be improved? And that can be to do with heat losses or distribution efficiency. And then there's a section covering unplanned outages and service interruptions. So will the project reduce the number of unplanned outages? And what level of gas and electricity savings is the project likely to achieve? And then the quality of supporting information. So you're asked to provide your baseline target figures for the network before and after the study, as we've mentioned earlier, which you can use to back up the figures, or if not, you should provide similar evidence from another study or that's been compiled during the application process when you've looked at your network to show how you've arrived at the figures and to justify the baseline and target data. So on to the next slide, please. So the next scoring criteria is number 3 is project narrative. And this is where you can provide all the details about your project, and really you should explain your project in as much detail as possible and how it aligns with our objectives around reducing carbon emissions, so that's objective 1, and reducing customer detriment, so that's objective 2. So the third element is how you plan to disseminate any information you get and any learnings. For example, do you have any other networks within your portfolio where you could apply the learnings from undertaking the capital works? and also how will you engage with customers before and during and after the works, and in particular how you'll engage with the wider market to share the experiences you've had and the measures you've implemented to improve on the efficiency of the network. So then number 4 is value for money. And we look at costs compared to the savings expected in carbon, gas and electricity. And then number 5 is data availability and baselining. So how much energy meter data you have, how frequently is it available, do you have access to operational data, how did you arrive at the baseline figures? And this is to help us understand how accurate the figures are and how you'll measure the effects of the measures installed. And then on to the next slide, please. So this one covers revenue applications and the scoring criteria that apply there. And the criteria is similar to the capital criteria. So we have the project narrative, which again, how does the project align with the HNES objective of reducing carbon emissions and customer detriment? And how will you disseminate the information across your own portfolio and more widely to help other heat networks? The second criteria is deliverability, and this deals with cost certainty and delivery certainty again. So ideally for cost certainty, we would like to see a quote or a number of quotes from different consultants. And for delivery certainty, we would like to see a project plan outlining when you expect to start and complete the study, and so that we can make sure that you're requesting the funding in the right funding years, the right financial year. And then data availability. This is similar information about energy, meter and operational data, and also similar baseline data to the capital application. So again, we need to see how you've arrived at the data you've provided. And for revenues applications, as we've seen earlier, we realise you may not have all the data. So this section is not too heavily weighted, but please provide as much data as possible, and let us know how accurate the figures are likely to be, and show how you've arrived at those figures, and justify what you've entered. So next slide, please. These are the round 9 timescales. So there's quite a lot on this slide, but the key points are when you're likely to get the funding, to get notified whether you've been funded or not, which is in week 17, essentially. So essentially, the assessment period starts from the week after the application deadline and runs for about 10 weeks. So from the 31st of March to the 6th of June. The assessment outcomes are then submitted to the HNES Investment Committee for review in weeks 11 to 14. And the Investment Committee is expected to make its funding recommendations to DESNZ for final approval in week 15. And once government approval has been given, applicants will be notified whether their application is successful or not. So according to the current estimates, round 9 applicants are likely to find out whether their application is successful around the second week in July, the week of the 9th of July. Grant funding agreements are then expected to be issued to applicants for signature in week 17, except for local authorities, which have to go through an additional Section 31 approvals process, and that takes several weeks. So we've scheduled in weeks 16 to 20 for that process. So there have been delays to earlier rounds for various reasons, so please note these dates are indicative only and they may change. Next slide, please. So during the assessment period, it's very important that people who were involved in the application are available to answer any questions. So clarification questions are raised by the assessors at various stages in the process. We have various rounds of clarifications. Typically, these are issued in weeks 1, 3, and 5. And it's essential that applicants are available during these weeks to ensure they can respond to clarifications in time. The Investment Committee may also raise clarifications, and that would be around week 12. However, clarifications can be issued at any time during the assessment process. and the deadline for responses is often short, so it's important to make sure there's somebody available throughout the assessment period, so that if the person responsible for the application is on leave or unavailable, other colleagues have been briefed and are able to respond. So next slide, please. So if the project is funded and you are successful, you'll need to submit monthly monitoring and reporting returns as a condition of the grant funding. So we will provide you with additional written guidance about the monitoring and reporting process if your application is successful, but we do recommend that you look at the blank template that's included in the application pack. And this just to ensure that you're able to provide all the necessary information if your application is successful. The reporting requirements and the templates for revenue and capital projects are slightly different. In both cases, reporting starts from the month the grant agreement is signed, and the monitoring forms need to be submitted monthly. So you need to provide updates on how the project is progressing, any risks and issues affecting the project, and estimates of when you expect to make grant claims, and for capital projects when you expect to spend match funding. So the revenue monitoring template has an extra sheet, and this is for the optimization study outputs. So this is filled in by the consultant on the final return once the optimization study has been completed. And that would be your final return, and you can stop the monitoring at that point once everything's complete. And with the capital template, it also has an extra sheet. This is filled in every quarter and covers the previous 3 months. So you'll have to provide technical data similar to the data on tab D of the application form. So you'll need to make sure that the person completing the returns knows how the tab D data was arrived at and have access to all the information. And this is really key once you come to the funding stage. You'll have to, I would really advise you to take a look at that data sheet, because basically you have to provide data for every month. We only collect it every 3 months, but it does cover every single month of your project. And then once your capital works have commissioned, you're also required to fill in the quarterly returns, so the 3 monthly returns for 2 years after your project works have completed. So that's quite a long period of time that you'll need to provide those for, and you need to plan for that. So we do advise you, as I said, to look at the form and make sure that you're able to provide all the necessary data. So moving on to the next slide, please. Grant claims. The grant claim process, I'll just briefly cover the grant claim process. It's different for local authorities and non-local authority organisations. So the main difference is that for non-local authority organisations, you can only claim the grant retrospectively. So you need to have spent the money and then you can claim it back. So to show that the money's been spent, you need to provide invoices and proof that the invoices have actually been paid and submit them with the grant claim form. So it's important to factor this into your project plan and leave enough time at the end of the financial year to obtain and pay invoices so that the claim can be processed before the end of the financial year. So the deadline for us to receive grant claims and evidence of spend for the financial year is around mid-March for the relevant financial year. So it's just important to bear that in mind. Capital projects also need to provide evidence of spend for all the match funding spend by the end of the project. So you need to show us essentially that all of your funding has been spent and that it's all eligible for HNES under the HNES scheme. So local authorities, as I said, it's a different process. They can claim the grant funding up front as a lump sum, and they just need to fill in the grant claim form to release the funding. So funding is released on a financial year basis. So if funding is split over different financial years, evidence needs to be provided to show that the grant has been spent before the next year's grant can be claimed. So you do need to provide that same evidence of invoices and proof of remittances or proof of payment of the invoices to release the following financial year grant. And local authorities also need to provide evidence of all the project spend covering grant and match funding by the end of the project, and will need to pay back any underspend. So next slide, please. So now we'll move back to Michael for pre-application support.
Thanks for that, Alison. Really useful. So I'm just going to be quite brief here on the pre-application support. So for any of you who are thinking of submitting an application, you can access front-end support from our pre-application support team, the team of which I will go into in a second. But then here you can discuss your application process, begin your application for submission. If you have any other questions that weren't answered in the Q&A we're just about to have on this call, then you can liaise with our relationship manager team. They can provide advice on obviously initial contact and application form, one-to-ones to discuss your application, first pass review of your application before it's submitted formally, responding to applicant queries prior to submission, and signposting to applicants that they are ready to submit. And as we've mentioned, just email hnes.support@gemserve.com. If you go to our website, I'll put the link in the chat in the Q&A function as well. Then you'll be able to access lots of resources there as well. So here is our lovely relationship manager team. We have Louise, Katie, Alison, and Roisin. And for all general inquiries that aren't necessarily related to support, it's hnes@gemserve.com. And that's for, as I said, general inquiries and to request application forms and SharePoint spaces to put all of the support your relevant documents. The guidance for applicants documents, I believe Louise has put the link in the chat if you want to access those, which provides a bit more details about the application process and the scheme itself. And you can also sign up to our mailing list, which is on the same link that I put in the Q&A function. The Department for Energy Security and Net Zero also have a handy optimization guide. And you can watch these and some heat network optimization guidance videos with some helpful top tips, etc., and how to improve your network. I'll be sending out obviously these slides at the end as well, so you'll be able to click on all of these links so that all of them are in one place, and all of the emails as well. So without further ado, I will move on to the Q&A. So I believe that Louise, as I said, you've been answering some of these questions, but there's a few that have come through both on the Q&A and the chat function. I think there was one that we missed right at the beginning in the chat. It was someone who from a NHS hospital trust. They're not a current consumer of heat networks, but can they apply for revenue to see the feasibility for a heat network?
Yes, so I think I did apply to it further down, but
Apologies,
yeah,
sorry.
essentially it's no, it's fine. It's yeah, as long as you are an operator of a heat network. So if the NHS hospital has a heat network for their buildings, obviously they wouldn't necessarily have customers in the same way as a residential building would. But as long as they have an existing heat network that isn't performing effectively, then yes, they are able to apply for revenue funding.
Brilliant. There's a question here about when do we expect round 7 project press release? That's my job, so I can answer that one. We're thinking beginning of March for that. Obviously, there's in every single round there's a lot of projects to announce. There's a lot of liaising with each individual project, and obviously we also have to speak with the government's own gridding team for when we can announce funding to the projects. We do this in round. So in terms of round 7, you can expect this sometime in early March, but we can update you closer to the time.
And then the answer for the round 8 one in terms of whether we're still on track, yes, at this stage. However, again, we're subject to government and ministerial approvals. So if there are any slippages as we go forward, we'll keep the round 8 projects updated. But at this stage, it's we don't envisage any.
Great. a couple more questions in the Q&A. One is, for both revenue and capital applications, does procurement have to be completed ahead of the application being submitted?
So no, it doesn't. There is an element within the application form where you can tell us if you have appointed a contractor, who that contractor is. There is a sort of text box to provide more detail on where you are in your procurement process. Obviously, if you have already gone through a procurement process and someone's appointed, then from a deliverability perspective, you're able to start quicker and start delivering sooner. There's obviously risks with procurement processes and sort of elongated timeframes and that, but no, there's no requirement to have completed a procurement process before you apply.
Thanks, Louise. Another one here. Do projects on networks with more vulnerable customers score higher in the application process?
There is a section in terms of, obviously there's a section around supporting our HNES objectives, of which those with what we describe as customers in need, that is an element of our scoring criteria. So on a like-for-like basis, someone that has a heat network that supports vulnerable customers or customers in need would score better than someone that doesn't. But obviously that's one element of the scoring criteria. So if the network isn't particularly poorly performing, or the improvements that are being suggested aren't that ambitious, for example, it doesn't necessarily mean that overall a project with vulnerable customers would score better than one that doesn't. But yes, it is obviously a key element in what we're trying to achieve through the scheme. So there is a weighting associated with that.
Great, thanks, Louise. One last one here. I think this one's also for you. It's just a bit about repeating the section about covering or not covering the cost of replacing HIUs. I think it was at the beginning. Yep.
Yes. So in terms of the metering and billing regulations, so like I say, if there is a legal requirement for you to install meters under the metering and billing regs, then we wouldn't be able to fund the installation of meters if that's a legal requirement for you to do so. We're aware that obviously within HIUs, meters are included within HIUs and come as kind of a component of those. So obviously if that's included within the cost of the HIU, then that's slightly different, because of what you're actually doing is replacing the HIU rather than you wouldn't be installing the HIU in order to meet your metering and billing regs requirements. So if you're replacing the HIU because that is a recommended efficiency measure, then that would be that you would be able to apply for the cost of replacing the HIUs. If you're if it's to put meters in to meet your metering and billing regs, then you wouldn't be eligible because you're not doing it for the right reasons, and actually you've got a legal requirement to do it. So yeah, it's slightly case by case depending on what's already there, and if it's a replacement of HIUs, then obviously the meters are already there in the first place. So you're not installing new ones, you're replacing existing ones, so you've already complied with your metering and billing regs requirements anyway. So yeah, it's worth having a look at the requirements under the metering and billing regs, particularly around your obligations under replacing and maintaining meters. But specifically what we talk about in terms of being ineligible under metering is installation of meters where they aren't there currently to meet metering and billing regs.
Great. Thanks, Louise. So I think that's all questions we have so far. Obviously, if you have any other questions, feel free to email us at hnes@gemserve.com. You can also, if you want to be the first to know any more information as it comes out, then please join our mailing list, or you can follow our social media accounts as well on LinkedIn and on X, formerly Twitter. As I said, I'll be sending out the slides and the recording post-event, so please do look out for this or for anyone who wasn't able to join. But otherwise, thanks to all our speakers and for everyone for joining today.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks. Bye.